Yeah, so Blake has done a great job at providing a background, but again, the idea is to shine a light on ranching as a conservation strategy. As you already know, privately owned ranches provide bird habitat, but a lot of other ecosystem services, like I was saying, carbon, water, food and fiber, open space, culture, uh, values, a lot of other, the so-called cultural ecosystem services. So we're providing us with a lot of things. But for ranchers, there are few economic incentives for stewardship. We pay them for their products, but they're managing a complex ecosystem, and again, producing a lot of other ecosystem services that they're not compensated for. So the incentive for them is to produce more products, say more pounds of beef, more calves, more lambs. So unless we start recognizing that they provide more than just one thing, they provide more than food, and unless we start allowing them to capitalize on that idea that they're natural resource managers more so than commodity producers, again, the tendency is for them, or the incentive is for them to produce more product, to focus on productivity instead of natural resource management. So hoping that this program changes that dynamic a little bit. Next. When I was with Defenders of Wildlife as director of the California Rangeland Conservation Coalition, we took a survey of ranchers in the Central Valley. That was back in 2010, I believe. And we asked them, this idea of markets for ecosystem services was kind of emerging. So we asked ranchers in California, we had about 400 responses, and we asked them what kind of ecosystem services they were interested in. And it was not surprising, but some of the results were kind of surprising. Very interested in things like increasing oak numbers, increasing improved water quality, increased carbon storage, restored native plants, and the number one activity that they were interested in is to provide or improve wildlife habitat. That surprised a lot. Didn't surprise me, but it surprised a lot of people in the conservation community, right? And then surveys taken after that keeps repeating that theme. And one of the reasons why ranchers are interested in improving wildlife habitat is because it's part of what they enjoy about being a rancher. It's the fact that they enjoy habitat. They see it every day. They enjoy seeing wildlife. They enjoy having it around, and they enjoy feeling that they're part of the reason why the habitat is there. So they feel that responsibility of, if I sell my ranch, what happens to all these values? What happens to the wildlife and all that? So ranchers are conservationists in California. I can speak for that in California. The problem is, as Blake was saying, that we're losing a lot of rangelands in California, about 20,000 acres a year. They're being converted to things like more intensive agriculture, which is actually more profitable than ranching, urban development, and recently energy development as well. So ranchers in California are what we say land rich and cash poor. The incentive for them is also to sell their land because they could make a lot of money. They don't make a lot of money on ranching. Most of them need to have off-farm income. So most of them, what they're doing is subsidizing their lifestyle. They're not ranching as an economic activity is a crazy proposition. It does not make sense from an economic sense. What keeps ranchers ranching in California is their desire to continue ranching, to pass it on to the next generation, and because they feel that responsibility that if they sell the ranch, that the ranch is going to be gone. It's going to be converted to something else. So the idea is, again, to keep them ranching as a conservation strategy. This is not new to Audubon. Audubon was actually one of the pioneers of this idea. I don't know if you guys remember, Audubon had the Land Owner Stewardship Program, 1999. I came to Davis in 2000, so I started interacting with people like Vance Russell, one of the pioneers of this program. And they actually Audubon bought Bobcat Ranch back in 2007 here in Yolo County. And the idea was to buy the ranch and then run it as as both a bird sanctuary and a working cattle ranch. And a lot of people in the conservation community thought, what is Audubon thinking? What are they talking about? It's impossible. They're crazy. Anyway, that allowed them to allow Audubon to start partnering with neighboring landowners and starting a really, really good program. They've done a lot of restoration in Yolo County, thanks to the fact that they became ranchers themselves. So they became part of the community. So other organizations followed Audubon's footsteps. That at that time, it was a really bold step. I came to California, and you could still hear the grazing free by 93 message going around in the conservation community. So again, for Audubon to take this bold step and recognize that actually it is a better idea to partner with ranchers instead of fighting with them. That led to the creation of a lot of different organizations in the United States with this idea of collaborative conservation, this idea of partnering for the environment instead of fighting for the environment, is meeting people where they're at, finding out what the common ground is. Organizations like the Quivira Coalition, Sustainable Northwest, the Malpace Borderlands Group in Arizona, and here in California, two organizations, the California Range and Conservation Coalition with more than 140 members right now, and the Central Coast Ranger and Coalition. And we are hoping to start one in Southern California with this idea that it is better to partner with people than to try to fight with them. So that's kind of the background. I'm gonna allow Matt. So this program, the Conservation Ranching Initiative, for me is really exciting because it's a natural evolution of that thinking about, okay, how do we do that? How do we can partner with ranchers, but unless we provide those incentives, again, the tendency for them is to sell their land and cash in and do something else that is more profitable and not as hard as ranching. So I'll let Matt explain how the program works, and then we'll wrap up discussing, what your role is, the role of Audubon chapters, and how we would like to partner with you. This Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Pelayo. As you guys can see on the slide here, the purpose is to create this market-based incentive for ranchers and land stewards that rewards them for protecting and enhancing grassland bird habitat on rangelands. Now, that seems like a pretty simple concept to follow, but I don't know how many folks are steeped in Audubon history, but around the turn of the century, some women from Massachusetts Audubon were some of the first folks to start protecting birds with a market-based incentive. So the great egret, their populations were plummeting because of women's fashion. They had their feathers in their hats. And so I think it's ironic that it took about 100 years for us to think of the same concept and create a market-based solution where consumers can feel good about their purchases and can reward folks for the food that they're producing because they know it's doing good things on the land. And the reason is bird populations are plummeting. So recently, about 2 years ago, Audubon and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology compiled a pretty comprehensive data set of bird populations over the past 50 years in North America. And losses are staggering. There are billions less birds, breeding birds, than there were 50 years ago. And one thing that kind of stands out is that grassland birds were the largest group of birds to decline over that period. So grassland birds have declined by around 53% in the past 50 years. Pretty staggering loss. If folks look at this chart, there's one other thing to me that stands out, and that's this group or population of wetland bird species has actually increased over the past 50 years. Interesting, but that coincides with implementation of NEPA, the EPA, and protection of waters of the US and of wetlands. So conservation does work for bird populations when you look at these larger data sets. So yeah, this is just another graph sort of looking at the different groups of species and how they've declined over time. So we know that there are different threats to birds, but Audubon did a meta-analysis called Survival by Degrees last year. It's published online in a cool interactive tool, but it looked at what the major threats to birds are that are going to be associated with anthropogenic climate change. And these were the major threats that came out as part of that analysis. In grasslands, sea level rise may not matter as much other than for coastal grasslands, but urbanization, crop expansion, this extreme summer heat that we're seeing here often, now the giga fires here in California, and the spring drought. So, we last year experienced the driest February on record, which is supposed to be the wettest month of the year. Now, when we break it down on a species by species basis, I think this is where, a lot of Auduboners and birders can kind of get into it. I pulled this figure from the Survival by Degrees tool online. But if you look at every bird within California, about 47% of grassland species are going to be vulnerable to these incremental changes in temperature. One species in particular is one of my favorite birds, and I think the ultimate indicator of grassland habitat for a lot of different reasons. And it's not my favorite because it's the state bird of Wyoming. It's also the state bird of 5 other states. So the meadowlarks aren't going to be partying like this one. Also ironic that the Latin name is Sternella neglecta. But with a temperature increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade, the western meadowlark could be extirpated from California, meaning it would lose all of its habitat based on the modeling that's been done. When we look at another species, there's been quite a few studies done on the eastern meadowlark, but to me, this just helps me wrap my head around these population losses. So, 3 in 4 eastern meadowlarks have disappeared since 1970. So if you're out in a rangeland or a grassland and you see a few meadowlarks on the fence, think about 50 years ago, there was 4 times that many meadowlarks. So it's around 720 million birds lost total. And breaking it down, populations fell by 3% every year between 1966 and 2015. That's a cumulative loss of eastern meadowlarks of 89%. Now, there's not as much data associated with the western, but I think it's safe to say that populations have decreased quite a bit. And the reason is that we're losing grasslands. In the Midwest, we're losing grasslands to major agricultural conversion to grow corn and soy that oftentimes is fed to cattle and feedlots. So western meadowlarks are a grassland obligate. They nest on the ground, they forage on the ground. And so that's why it's important for us in our program to focus in on grasslands. Now, California is kind of a different beast because there's so much rangeland in California that isn't necessarily grassland. And so we've kind of had to adapt our program to think about areas that are grazed and what birds utilize those areas that are grazed here in the state. When we think about other species too, the California quail, pretty common. It's one of the indicator species that we use in our protocols. But with the temperature increase and associated habitat changes, there won't be much habitat left for California quail. Another one in these oak woodlands, it's the Central Coastal Foothills and Mountains ecoregion of California, the bathtub ring around the Central Valley of oak savannas, as well as in the foothills throughout the state. Temperature changes and these threats associated with them are definitely going to change where they can live and whether they survive. So if we break it down a little more and we think about these major threats to grasslands, land conversion, obviously suburban and urban expansion is big here in California. Pelayo already said that we're losing at least 20,000 acres a year of California rangelands. In the Central Valley, production agriculture, poor management. Here, in a lot of places, non-native species have provided surrogate habitat. So we've sort of gone through a a transition in the state of vegetation assemblages, but invasive species are still a major threat here in California. The weather's great, and so a lot of things like it, and then climate change. So that sounds like things like we're in trouble. there's a lot of things going on. So the challenge is how do we affect change on rangeland management to reverse these population declines in grassland birds, and at the same time be providing all of these other ecosystem services. But it creates this opportunity for us to connect the general public and connect consumers to think sustainably and economic and ecologic thought processes when thinking about management. I didn't say that well, but basically consumers can make good decisions and support programs like this one. I guess we can't talk about climate change in California or grassland habitat without talking about fire and fire resiliency. Audubon's Bobcat Ranch in Yolo County was the first certified property in the state and is the flagship for the program here. It has the highest return fire frequency out of any place in California. So it's burned 7 of the past 10 years. So it's kind of a good platform to think about how grazing and grazing management can affect fire regimes, but also habitat for birds. So assessing risk. We have an active partnership with CAL FIRE, which is great. Also provides us an opportunity to monitor carbon and look at carbon flux and change over time with grazing and with fire. And not just wildfire, using fire as a tool for invasive species management or particular habitat considerations when we think about what's out there. So it's a good opportunity for us. So we know, excuse me, grassland birds are facing a crisis. How can we achieve this lasting change to reverse population declines? Connecting management for livestock producers and these folks in the market with a demand for healthy food and sustainability. We know that a lot of these ecosystems, grasslands in particular, evolved with grazing. So there was natural ungulates in these ecosystems where these hooved animals grazed grasses and forbs and sedges, and those plant species evolved to be grazed. They evolved to be stimulated by grazing. They evolved in areas where hoof action would do things for the soil, like create pitting where water could infiltrate, where nutrient cycling could happen from waste from the animals. And all of the species that utilize those areas also co-evolved with those grazers and co-evolved with those systems. So in a lot of places, and in California state parks in particular, we've taken grazing, natural grazing out of these systems, and it can cause different things to happen on the ground. But knowing that grassland birds need grazers, I think is a good way to start the conversation for our program. Tying that into business for ranchers, we start with this biological monitoring. So we monitor for vegetation, soils, and birds. That can empower consumers by looking at the seal to know that good things are happening on the ground. So having consumers recognize this green seal and know that all of these things are happening, which rewards the rancher for these good practices. When I go and talk to a rancher, the first thing they ask me is, what's in it for me? What's the bottom line? How much is it going to cost? Well, our program doesn't cost anyone anything monetarily, but it could involve major management changes or changes to management practices. So it creates bird-friendly habitat, which ties into our monitoring and is a full circle when it comes back. This photo is Nora Harper. She's from the Orvis Ranch in the Central Valley. And they're doing things I've seen no one else do in the Central Valley just with grazing. And, they have habitat in mind when they graze, but every other neighboring ranch that I visited has been devastated by the drought. So the drought has has lasted for several years, and they barely have any habitat. And as soon as you drive onto the Orvis Ranch, there's flocks of meadowlarks everywhere. So kind of a cool backstory. So Birds in Business, we become partners in sustainable land management. We certify beef products as bird friendly. That's not completely true. So our certification actually certifies the land that the animals are raised on. So if a single producer grazes on 5 different parcels, we write a habitat management plan as an umbrella for their operation, but then dive into specifics for every parcel. And I'll get into that here in a while. Mary had a question earlier that asked if it was cattle only. So our seal is only allowed to be put on beef product based on labeling requirements through the USDA. But since we actually certify the land, essentially an operator that has goats or sheep could still have certified land and have other animals grazing on those properties. We also have a national support from Audubon nationally, where we have a full-time position for communications and a full-time position for marketing, knowing that if there's no incentive financially for an operator, that it'll be hard for them to follow through with some of the things that we ask. And then regional and national promotion of the product. So as far as impact, so far we're in 15 states. I think there's around 120 ranches total, 3.2 million acres, several restaurants and retailers. We have a goal of 2.5 million acres by the end of this year. So you can see here, the program started in the Midwest in the tall grass prairies, moved its way into the midgrass, the short grass, the sagebrush steppe, the Chihuahuan grasslands of Texas, and 2.5 years ago, made it to California here. It's been a while, 2.5 years, but so far we have 8 operators in the state that are fully certified, and 10 more that are enrolled in the program as part of the certification process. Now, a grass-fed, grass-finished operation in the tall grass prairie of the Midwest can have a ranch that's 500 acres, and they can have their calves, wean them, and get them to finishing age, only feeding them grass in a relatively small area and short amount of time. In California, because of the precipitation gradients and the diversity in landscapes, it takes a grass-finished operator several different pieces of land in different ecoregions to be able to finish their animals. So our 8 operators graze on 30 different ranch properties. There's 20 more enrolled, and those 30 properties come out to about 235,000 acres, with 300,000 more enrolled, operating right now in 11 different counties, with 5 more enrolled. So you can see the figure here with the different ecoregions of California and where current properties are. Now, this is going to get kind of heavy here when we dive into protocols, but I'm going to give a general overview of our protocols, and then we could dive into questions at the end of the presentation. We have these 4 pillars or 4 main protocols, and I start with forage and feeding, animal health and welfare, environmental sustainability, and habitat management. So when you look at all the other beef certifications on the market, the majority of them cover this forage and feeding piece, which means, we prohibit antibiotics, animal byproducts, no grains, so we're all grass-fed, grass-finished. Animal health and welfare is similar to the Global Animal Partnership. So specifics on how animals are cared for, whether they have protection, whether they're in confined spaces, and growth hormones. So no growth hormones are allowed. Environmental sustainability has a lot of overlap with the organic certifications. So stipulations on the use of herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, neonicotinoids, riparian habitat protection, and looks at plant species diversity and pollinator habitat. Now, what sets Audubon's ACR program aside from every other beef cert on the market is that we really dive into this habitat management piece. We develop a specific list of focal bird species for an ecoregion, look at resource concerns for other wildlife species, and look at the grazing plan of a property and an operator, and think about sort of how to maximize the most bang for our buck when we think about the role that grazers play with creating habitat. This is a table from Bobcat Ranch's habitat management plan. You know, there's a lot of folks in the state that are doing parallel work with ours and writing plans for ranches, whether it's conservation plans or carbon farm plans. And most of the producers I work with are not going to go reference their plan on a daily basis. So we want these plans that we co-develop with producers to actually be useful for their operations. So this is a table that I pulled out that just has check boxes based on their goals and objectives, whether it's increasing infrastructure and water facilities on a place so that they can rotate animals, assessing wildfire risk, looking at soil health, plant communities, and monitoring those. And then here are some focal species for Audubon's Bobcat Ranch, and looking at special management considerations for each of those. I won't dive into too many specifics, but they're all kind of connected and tied to ranching. Our program is verified by a third-party auditor who is the Food Alliance. And so the Food Alliance is actually the folks who provide the certification letter. So once a rancher has adopted the practices, co-developed a habitat management plan, and filled out an application, then they submit that to Food Alliance, and Food Alliance audits it. They do a desktop audit, and then they do an in-person audit. They do these annually. Different stipulations within our protocols are 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, and 10 year protocols. So we're trying to build these relationships over time and sort of set the standard for folks based on the practices that they're doing on the ground. So once an operator is fully certified, then they can use Audubon's seal in marketing and in communication, on their website, on their product. And some folks see that as a plus. For monitoring on our properties, we monitor not because it's a requirement of the Food Alliance, but because Audubon wants to be able to tell the story about the practices that are happening on the ground, and also inform the ranchers so that they can be adaptive. Adaptive management is really important. So we look at soils, vegetation, and birds, and we've partnered with Point Blue Conservation Science and the Range Monitoring Network, which has been operating for almost 10 years here in the state. And they have a vast amount of knowledge and a large data set now for the information they're collecting. Soil health, we kind of look at these basics, but they're all tied to the things that matter and the things that are associated with grazing and how grazing can impact soils. So physical stuff is texture. We look at TOC, total organic carbon in the soil, bulk density, and water infiltration. Again, I can talk about how all these things are related, but we'll save it for the end if folks have questions. Vegetation, we use the point line intercept methodology to look at total ground cover, diversity and composition, the plants that are providing habitat for birds on the ground. And then we do point counts for birds. And so usually these are randomly generated points, and not necessarily only in grassland habitat, but we focus in on riparian habitats as well, because they're so critical for a lot of these areas. Now, where does all that data go, and what do we use it for? So the National Audubon Science Team developed a tool called the Bird Friendliness Index. So basically the BFI takes species abundance and species diversity, and then looks at the resiliency of a landscape based on geospatial analysis and adds all those together. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the statistics in the bird friendliness index. But it's something that we can use as a tool to inform our management on the ground on if bird populations are actually increasing. One thing that people don't usually talk about when they talk about the BFI is that birds can fly and bird populations are decreasing all over the place. So it's really hard for migratory birds to be able to quantify this on the ground. But one thing is for sure is that if our BFI is increasing and our species and abundance of birds are increasing, then we're probably doing good things on the ground as far as grazing goes. This is a figure of our ranches when it's compared to regional averages. So we do use the BFI as a comparative model to look at other ranches and ecosystems around where our operators are grazing. So that's the BFI. We can talk more about it later. I'm going to take a drink of water quick, and then we'll hop into the landscape prioritization. So the landscape prioritization, when ACR came to California, we wanted to know where the program could have the most conservation value, or where would the program have the most impact on the ground. So we ran an analysis that took 13 different factors, whether they were physical, biological, or socioeconomic, and we put those into a hierarchy model where we had a panel of experts rate one factor to another factor on a 0 to 1 scale. So they'd go through every single factor, rate them, which gave us a ranking for each one of these factors. Then we took the geospatial data for each one of those factors with its ranking and overlaid it over the state of California. So this is kind of an example. Climate refugia, or the resilience of an area to climate change, focal species that we're concerned with, and essential wildlife connectivity. These are 3 of the higher ranking factors we used. And then the figure that we came out with in the end was this. So the things that jump out to me right away as far as these priority levels go are the very low priority areas. So obviously they're in the Central Valley. These are areas that have already been divvied up and are in production agriculture. And the low or the high priority areas sort of pop out as areas that have some of these unbroken landscapes, high biodiversity, and climate refugia. And for us, the one where we think grazing is more important is the Central Coast. And so that's where we think about expanding our program, is Central Coast, where we can have kind of the most impact, and one of the reasons we're excited to be with you guys today. Moving on to this opportunity for chapter engagement, California is amazing because there's 42 different active Audubon chapters in the state, and this is a map of chapter coverage within the state. So it's just this amazing resource, not just from the consumer base and how folks can purchase the beef, but so many great programs and just like grassroots conservation going on around the state. I know Monterey is kind of ahead of the game when it comes to chapter engagement, but we're looking at ways to partner with chapters on properties. Monitoring is probably the most expensive thing that we do. So if we could partner with chapters on doing point count monitoring or training volunteers to do vegetation and soils monitoring, it could be huge, whether it's through point counts or area searches or just knowing a landscape better than I do. You know, I'm based in Sacramento and I work all over the state, but you guys really know your local bird communities. So another opportunity is just networking. You know, that consumers have a direct impact on the land with their food purchasing decisions. Sharing the story of knowing that these ecosystems evolved with grazing, and that they're integral to the health of grasslands is important. There's a lot of folks that still think all grazing is bad. And then just knowing that management practices can significantly benefit bird populations. So this purchasing power piece, a lot of folks ask me, where can we get it? Where can we get it? Well, 3 of our certified operators here in California source directly. So Stemple Creek, Markey Guard Family Grass-Fed, and Morris Grass-Fed. Morris Grass-Fed is the closest to you guys. He's based out of San Benito. And then we recently have a brand partnership with Panorama Meats, where the brand Panorama Meats made it a requirement of all of their producers to become Audubon certified. So Panorama Meats is now certified, and the majority of their producers are in California. So right now they can be found at Whole Foods, but they can be found at a lot of other local markets. So I have a link to retailers in California, and this is our national link to where you can get bird-friendly beef. Next steps are to engage with our chapters, to collaborate on monitoring and outreach, connect consumers to certified ranches, certify more ranches. So, we actually have a waiting list right now, which is not the problem with our program in other parts of the country, but there's a lot of interest in the program here. So thinking about how we can expand our capacity with helping chapters and certify more ranches, expand retailers. A big piece that I think is hard in the grazing industry is incorporating equity and diversity and inclusion in our program. And so we're trying to think outside the box of how we can do that. And I think Pelayo can speak to it a little more in being adaptive, not just with the program, but with the things we're recommending on the ground and adapting to change, because change is happening. So we've got some more information here. It sounds like Amanda has been recording the presentation. So I think she can share it, and then I can send out links at the end, but we'd love to open things up for discussion and have it be a little more interactive.
That's awesome. Thanks, Matt. So yeah, if anybody's got questions, you can either raise your hand with the little reaction button at the bottom, or you can probably just physically raise your hand or also unmute and ask your question.
Blake, did we answer your question?
You sure did. That's great. I recall hearing about the Morris folks, and in fact, I think some years ago I saw them at our farmers markets. So it's really cool that they've seen value in participating in the program. I do have one more question about that, and that is additional sort of economic activities that you guys feel are useful tools for ranchers to incentivize conservation. I know hunting is probably a mixed bag, keeping those lands in semi-wild rangeland conditions, and then letting hunters come out and go pig hunting, or maybe even trophy elk hunting, or whatever it is, maybe even ecotourism. Are there additional tools that you guys have seen work in California to try and give them more economic opportunity for not, becoming vineyards or crop rows or whatever?
Yeah, Pelayo mentioned it earlier that most ranchers aren't in it for the money. I think a lot of folks here are pretty progressive in how they've integrated different aspects into their business. I know several ranches that have wedding venues out there. Hunting is huge, and a lot of hunters are conservationists, and so quite a few ranchers that we work with have already partnered with Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Pheasants and Quail Forever, Ducks Unlimited, those types of organizations, and most of them are leasing hunting rights out to folks. And there's lots of other opportunities with ecotourism. I don't know a single ranch that I work with that actually does guided bird trips on their places, but I think that could be an opportunity. We work with some folks that do wildflower tours.
That's really cool. You know, I think of sadly, or not sadly, we don't have the same ecotourism draw, but this has become a real thing with jaguar tourism in South America and Central America, where they've sort of reconciled cattle ranching to these charismatic animal ecotourism events. And I do think there is an opportunity, you know, on these places to go photograph golden eagles and photograph mountain bluebirds. So, I mean, it's something worth all of us exploring.
Do you know if they sacrificed any of their cattle for the jaguars down there?
Yeah, oh, yeah, I'm pretty sure they've sacrificed many. Yeah.
Yeah. But one of our producers grazes on the Bitter Creek Condor Refuge. And since his animals have no antibiotics, no hormones, any animals that pass away, they use to feed the condors. So kind of cool for us. The California condors are eating bird-friendly beef too.
Blake, I'm glad you mentioned diversification, because I think it's probably the best strategy right now for ranchers to stay in business on the cattle. The beef business or the lamb business is tough. But again, so for hunting, for instance, the survey that I showed you some results of, there's a lot of hunting going on California ranches and zero economic or financial benefit from it. So that would be something that we could really explore. But something, you know, this idea of bird walks or wildflower walks or something, if you guys are interested, I think the best way to start is somewhere like, you know, start locally.
Yeah.
If you see an opportunity and see where it takes you. That's the idea we have for, you know, California's a big state. There's 2 of us right now, and we have a wait list of ranchers. The reason why I'm really excited about partnering with chapters is because we're hoping that in a way you kind of trying to create a network of support for these ranchers who are willing to join the program. But the network of support needs to be local, right? These folks need to be supported by people like you who know the local environment, who know the markets, the consumers, the local politics and policies, who are in a better position to understand how ranching fits into your overall conservation strategy. So in a way, we're hoping that chapters, quote unquote, adopt their ACR certified ranchers and say, hey, these are our ranchers to protect, and let's partner with them. Let's help them manage their land better for better habitat. And so this program has to work. I mean, we can support them at this from our office in Sacramento, but the best support they can have is building a network of support. Connect them with the, you know, federal and state agencies, connect them with other conservation organizations, connect them with the local communities, the schools, the hospitals. Again, we're hoping to build a network of support and say, hey, you know, yeah, financial incentives are great, but the first thing we can do to these folks is recognize that they're doing a good job, because they've been pretty beat up by meatless Mondays and beef is bad and all these things. And so even if we sometimes you give them the recognition, like thank you for taking care of our habitat, for taking care of our landscape, for taking care of our water, our carbon, our climate, all these things. And that, I think it's better if it happens locally. So that's the hope. It's not going to work everywhere, but I think I'd like to try and see where it's going to work. But again, I think that the ranchers are, again, financial incentives are great, but just general support is also good. Just knowing, again, just give them a pat on the back every once in a while and say, hey, thank you. The birds thank you, the people thank you. Right.
It's kind of hokey, but somebody from Audubon National told me that I'm going to feel good when I buy bird-friendly beef. And I'm like, I'm not going to feel good when I buy something. Like, it's just not. So I was in the Laramie, Wyoming co-op. Laramie is a small town. The co-op's a small place too. And I saw ACR beef there. And I was like, oh, well, I'm going to buy some. Well, I read it and it was grown on the Reed Ranch. Well, I had done sage grouse reclamation work on the Reed Ranch. And I bought it and I felt good about myself. And I was like, wow, I've been there. Like I've seen this. And I think that type of engagement could be really cool for chapters. You know, if we can get a new place for you guys to bird, or if we can develop monitoring programs, you know, and you can be like, well, like I'm eating something off a piece of property that I'm helping preserve. I think it's really cool.
So there's a question on the chat about malt, and I believe I'll send you the link. Malt just ran a story on the ACR program. Yes, the land trusts are a natural partner for this ACR program. Like Matt was saying, Audubon actually certifies the land. So even if a land trust is interested in joining, we haven't done that yet. I think the Sac Valley Conservancy is one of the first folks we talked to. The other one is the Foothills Conservancy. They're interested in the program. The Foothills, they do sell beef, but the Sac Valley Conservancy doesn't. They're still interested in the partnership and in the management and providing better bird habitat. We did have some conversations, Matt, is that true, with Big Sur? I remember or at least had some initial conversations with Big Sur Land Trust. But yeah, Land Trust, it's just a lack of our capacity. We should engage with them because they're a natural partner for this program. But malt, yeah, definitely. I'll send you the link. Someone sent it to me. But we have not had the time or the capacity to fully engage with Land Trust yet. We're trying to get through our waiting list. We're trying to prioritize family ranches first, and then we get onto the land trust. But again, it would be ideal for us to partner with land trusts.
I think one thing, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping over anybody, I think for all of us, everyone on this presentation who knows even a little or cares, you know, show people a good picture of a golden eagle, right? That's California grasslands and rangelands. And that's why we need them to keep existing. You know, people don't appreciate how direct the link is, right? And how little federally protected land, public, federally protected or state protected land there is to act as reservoirs for these just really incredible species, ferruginous hawk and golden eagle and everything. And if you have the 5-star photo and you can show them and you say, well, you know, these birds can't eat here if it's covered in crop rows, or if it's covered in grapes, or if it's all windmills and all solar panels, or whatever it is, you know. The general public, and even a concerned general public, does not connect those dots. And so many people, and it happens to me all the time, even now, we're in this really difficult position about you know, no vegetarian diets and the climate and the struggle around climate, and being able to talk intelligently about biodiversity and being able to encourage people to have a nuanced, subtle conversation where there isn't meat is evil and veganism is good, right? And you say, well, actually, if we convert all these rangelands to intensive agribusiness, these species can't probably survive there. So we need to find a way to hit the biodiversity targets and the climate targets. Preaching to the choir. I love preaching to the choir.
Yes, we're gonna end up hiring Blake for our program. Next.
Don't take him away. We need him. I had a quick question, actually. I think all this grazing and ranching effort must be done for private ranch owners, I imagine. But is there anything? What's the story with like grazing on federal lands? Because I feel like there's a lot in the news recently about grazing on federal lands and not being managed well by the feds, or you know, ranchers being able to graze at some really cheap price, and that I imagine is detrimental. That form of grazing, right? So could you speak to that, perhaps?
Yes, and that's so. As Matt was saying, a lot of, or probably all of our grass-fed, grass-finished ranches rely on leased land, and so they are grazing a lot of public land. In fact, even outside of our program, a lot of public land in the state of California is grazed for conservation objectives. And yes, a lot of folks have seen a lot of overgrazing on public lands, which is a result of grazing for pounds of beef grazing only for cattle gains. Back in the days, the idea was we have to produce food that has to be cheap and readily available. That has changed, right? As a society now, that's not what we want. We want food that is produced in a way that is not just not detrimental or neutral, but it's also beneficial to the environment, which is possible, right? So yeah, there's been a lot of overgrazing. I think in the at least in the lower elevations that is not happening anymore. In higher elevations, it's still controversial. Part of the reason is the agencies don't have the capacity to monitor, and so then and again, conventional ranching, more traditional ranching was about is leaving the cows out for 6 months of the year and coming back 6 months later and picking them up, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about managed grazing that has clear conservation objectives. So the grazing is there to fulfill a conservation objective, not just cattle or weight gains.
Right.
But yeah, that's still even some of the state agencies are still, so grazing is still controversial. And there's a good reason. There's been a lot of overgrazing. A lot of folks have seen a lot of overgrazing. They're really, and I don't blame them. They're still really reluctant to see grazing as a tool, again, with clear goals, with good management and with good monitoring. That's what we have been missing all this time. But that is changing too. So that's a great question. Most ranchers will not make it in the state of California without access to grazing land, whether it's public or private through leases. So the more we can do to give them more access, again, as long as there's monitoring protocols, there's management protocols, and there's a follow-up and a good relationship and clear, defined conservation goals, that's what we're hoping to see more.
From a programmatic or protocol standpoint for our program, we might be moving to a lifetime raised on, but right now it's the last 6 months of an animal's life has to be spent on an ACR certified property. So if an operator grazes on public land, that land has to be incorporated in the habitat management plan and follow all the protocols. So we have several producers that graze on National Forest, BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife land, and state parks land. And those places are certified with our seal, and the protocols have to be met.
Wow. Cool, thank you.
So Amanda, we'd be happy to hear about that rancher you've been working with, who's interested.
Yeah,
again, we have a waiting list.
I was gonna say, I'm like, it sounds like there's a long line, but yeah, it's a ranching family, the Dowds, down in Big Sur, and a lot of the parcels, and it might be true across all of California, but at least in Big Sur, back in the day when they were just kind of divvying up the land, it kind of went straight across, just like following like the, latitudinally across the Santa Lucia Mountains, across Salinas Valley, and then up towards, I guess, the Gabilands on the other side of the valley. And that's kind of one of our important bird areas that doesn't have any protections within it, the King City Grasslands that Blake was talking about. And this guy owns the ranch land on the Big Sur side. That's what he's working to get into a conservation easement. And then he also owns land on the King City side. And he was explaining, like you said, how he has to move the cows around because you can't just leave them on one plot because this dries up over here and we have to go over there. And I didn't realize it was so complicated until I went out and got to chat with him. But I was like, oh, he's the perfect partner, for our grasslands efforts. So yeah, hopefully I can get him in touch with you guys and get him on the road.
I'm here.
Oh my goodness, there you are, John.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
you're JP Daddy.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
This is the guy.
I think the King City Ranch might be interesting for it because it's probably one of the flattest rangelands left in Monterey County. So
Yeah, and I think
be interesting to come see the birds out there.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, even though we have a waiting list, it's not too soon to start the process. So and we have developed a prioritization criteria to when people call us to, instead of doing like a first come first serve, is like, okay, let's figure out this year how many ranchers can we certified what are the priorities. But one thing that you have going for you is that Central Coast is our priority area as far as
Yeah.
as the
And
program.
I'm selling beef
That'll
too
give you
directly.
extra points.
Yeah.
But yeah, looking forward to talking to you. That's again, it is a good problem to have, right? Having ranchers calling us, that tells us, it's really encouraging to telling us that, you know, there's some interest, and the idea is not for us to provide, you know, to kind of set bars and have ranchers, you know, jump over hoops. The idea is to partner, is like, can we create a partnership in which we help each other, you know, you help us with the bird habitat, but we help you manage land and stay in business. That's, again, it's not about us setting bars. It's about how can we work together. That's basically the idea of the program. Not for us to make the ranchers jump over hoops.
That's a really good point, Pelayo. I mean, one of the things we try to do is link our operators with state and federal programs that have funding for projects on the ground, whether that's for infrastructure and water or for actual habitat restoration. And so we've been having ongoing discussions with state and federal agencies about how to align our plans with some of their requirements so that it can streamline the grant process to get operators incentives on the ground.
And some of the ranchers are interested in the Audubon certification, not because of marketing, but because kind of gives them the credibility to get onto the next lease. Let's say, you know, kind of gives them the kind of like a certification that says, hey, you know, this rancher knows how to graze for conservation objectives, you know, and at the same time, you know, keeping their operation viable. But that, so again, some of the ranchers like, you know, I'm not gonna market any animals, but being Audubon certified, again, gives me the credibility when I'm negotiating a grazing lease. So we're happy to provide that. Whatever we can do to keep ranchers ranching, you know, we try to help with.
Well,
So,
super.
J-
Any other
JP
final thoughts? Oh yeah, go ahead, Matt.
JP, is your name JP?
It's John Dowd, but
Okay.
everything's, my middle name's Patrick. So yeah,
Okay.
it's, but also, when I was in college, we took a tour of Joe Morris's ranch. And so ever since then, I've been a big fan of his. So he's very, I try to emulate him as much as I can. So he's a perfect person to be at the forefront of your chapter.
Well,
Yeah, and so that's why I describe this program as a partnership. For folks like Joe, it's not, you know, it'd be kind of arrogant of us to try to tell Joe how to manage his land. It's more about us learning how Joe manages it. We get more of that partnership than we give Joe. It's for us to, you know, it's like learning what he's done and then trying to replicate it and tell others, share that with other folks and say, hey, you know, what Joe's doing, it may not work the same on your ranch, but at least the idea or the concepts you can use. So yeah, it is a really cool partnership.
Well, guys, really grateful again for your work. I hope we build more and more capacity in this program in particular. We certainly need to, we all do, because it's really important. And we'll be in touch about all the local opportunities, and hopefully this Zoom is watched widely. We'll distribute it in all our newsletters and make it available. And yeah, keep trying to move forward. So thank you all for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation. We're hoping for an actual visit soon. Again, you're one of our priority areas, so be happy to visit.
We'll go get the shots of the golden eagles.
That's right. That'd be great.
All right.
Thanks again, you guys, and thanks
Thanks
everyone
again.
who's joining
Thank
us.
you.
Have a good rest of the night.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
now.
Bye.